Only 20% of flak gun crewmen survived the war. Their job was simple: stand in the open, face the sky, and fire at swarms of Allied bombers, all while being the #1 target. These crews manned weapons so feared they became legends of both the skies and the battlefield. In this video, we'll uncover why their survival rate was so brutally low, the secret tactics that made them deadly, and later, the surprising truth about what happened to many of them after the war. Details history rarely tell. In the years leading up to World War II, few could have predicted that one of the most feared jobs in the entire conflict would be manning a cannon pointed at the sky. Germany, still under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, was banned from developing heavy weaponry. But deep inside secret workshops and under the guise of research projects, engineers were designing something lethal: an anti-aircraft gun capable of hitting enemy bombers at extreme altitudes. That design became the legendary 8.8-centimeter flak gun, better known simply as the 88. At first, its role seemed straightforward: defend against incoming aircraft. But war has a way of bending the purpose of any weapon, and the men assigned to operate these guns had no idea they'd soon be facing a role that would become one of the deadliest postings in the entire German military. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and quickly swept across Western Europe, the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft branch was already prepared with more than 2,600 of these guns, more than double what Britain could field at the time. In the early months, a flak crew's life was long stretches of waiting, drills, and occasional bursts of action. It wasn't considered glamorous, like flying a fighter plane or commanding a tank, but it was crucial. The skies were becoming a battlefield of their own, and the flak batteries were the last line of defense for cities, factories, and military installations. The gun's devastating accuracy meant it quickly gained a reputation, not just among the Germans who praised it, but among Allied pilots who feared it. In fact, its efficiency made it a target. Allied crews began marking the location of FLAK batteries during missions, ensuring they'd be destroyed on the next pass. For the men on the guns, this meant their victories in shooting down bombers were often short-lived. The better they performed, the more likely they'd draw retaliation. Later in this video, we'll get into the chilling reason why these crews, despite their skill and importance, had only a 20% chance of survival by the war's end. To the untrained eye, operating a flak gun might look like a single man pulling a trigger. In reality, it was a tightly coordinated ballet of precision and speed involving up to 10 men, each with a role that could mean the difference between life and death. There was the aimer, the loader, the fuse setter, the commander, the spotters, and in larger batteries, rangefinder operators and radio personnel. The 88mm could hurl a shell weighing nearly 10 kilograms to altitudes of over 26,000 feet, but hitting a moving bomber at that height required calculation down to fractions of a second. The fuse had to be set so the shell exploded at the perfect point in the bomber's path, not too early, not too late, or the shot was wasted. This is where Germany's advanced fire control systems came into play. In some positions, crews received data from centralized predictor units or radar stations, giving them precise coordinates to aim their guns. The information would be shouted down the line as loaders slammed shells into the breech. The gun recoiled violently, and another round was chambered in seconds. But with every shot, there was a cost. The gun's thunderous blast and rising smoke marked their position to the bombers above. Allied air crews quickly learned to identify the location of gun batteries by the bursts in the sky and would direct strafing runs or drop bombs specifically on those points. The crews had almost no protection. The thin steel shields mounted on some guns could deflect small arms fire, but against bombs, cannon rounds, and strafing fire, they were worthless. Shrapnel was everywhere, sometimes from the enemy, sometimes from their own shells detonating too close. They lived beside their guns, sleeping in foxholes or crude bunkers, knowing an attack could come at any moment. In the sweltering heat of summer, uniforms stuck to their backs as they worked non-stop. In winter, ice formed on the breach, and frostbite chewed at fingers. And every time a distant hum in the sky turned into the roar of bomber engines, each man knew this could be the moment their luck ran out. By 1942, the war had shifted. The Allies had seized the initiative in the air, and Germany's cities were in the crosshairs of relentless bombing campaigns. The RAF pounded targets at night, while the U.S. 8th Air Force struck during the day, creating a 24-hour cycle of destruction. With Luftwaffe fighters stretched thin, flak batteries became the primary defense. For the crews, this meant going from occasional engagements to sometimes facing multiple raids a day. The danger wasn't just from the bombs. They were being actively hunted. Allied fighter escorts developed tactics to sweep in low and fast, strafing gun positions with machine guns and cannons before the bombers even arrived. Bombers themselves began carrying fragmentation bombs designed specifically for anti-aircraft suppression. These weapons scattered hundreds of steel fragments in all directions, tearing through gun shields, flesh, and bone. For a flak gunner, death could come in the form of a direct hit, a spray of shrapnel, or a bullet from a diving P-51 Mustang. Losses mounted. Entire batteries could be wiped out in a single raid, forcing the Luftwaffe to fill the ranks with wounded veterans, older men, and teenage boys barely old enough to shave. In some cities, the defense relied heavily on members of the Hitler Youth, many of whom received only weeks of training before being thrown into live combat. The casualty rate climbed so high that by the end of the war, only about 20% of those who had served on flak crews were still alive. Later in this video, we'll explore the grim truth about what it was like to fight not only bombers in the sky, but also tanks on the ground. Because the 88's deadliest role wasn't always firing upward. As the Allied bombing intensified, German engineers realized they needed more than scattered batteries in open fields. They needed fortresses. The answer came in the form of massive flak towers, or Flaktürme, colossal concrete structures that rose above city skylines in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. These towers were essentially skyscraper-sized fortresses, with walls up to 3.5 meters thick, designed to withstand even the heaviest Allied bombs. Atop them sat multiple 128mm and 88mm flak guns, capable of creating lethal curtains of fire thousands of feet above the city. For the crews stationed inside, the towers provided something rare, a degree of safety. Anti-aircraft crews on open ground often had no shelter, but in the towers, operators were shielded by reinforced concrete, with supply rooms, sleeping quarters, medical facilities, and even civilian air raid shelters. Yet safety was relative. While the thick walls could stop bombs, they could not protect the crews from the psychological toll of constant combat. Every time a raid approached, the gunners climbed to the top decks and unleashed a deafening barrage. The air would be thick with cordite, the vibrations from the guns shaking the entire structure, the echo of explosions bouncing off the concrete. The towers became a nightmare for Allied air crews, so much so that many pilots admitted they avoided certain bombing runs entirely because of the concentration of fire. But this notoriety also made them priority targets. Some raids were designed purely to suppress or destroy these towers, dropping enormous payloads in an attempt to overwhelm their defenses. Inside, crews were sometimes trapped for hours during prolonged bombardments, listening to the rumble of detonations and wondering if the next one would find a weak spot. Later in this video, we'll explore how these towers, once symbols of German resilience, became desperate last holds during the final days of the war, and what happened to the men who manned them when the enemy closed in. While the 88mm was legendary for shooting down bombers, it earned an even deadlier reputation on the ground. By 1940, during the French campaign, German commanders realized the 88's high velocity and armor-piercing shells could slice through Allied tanks at ranges other guns couldn't match. Suddenly, flak crews, trained to fire upward, were being ordered to level their barrels and engage armored formations head-on. This shift was not without risk. In anti-aircraft mode, the crews could be hundreds of meters from their targets. In anti-tank mode, They were often within direct sight of enemy armor. Once the first shot was fired, the enemy knew exactly where they were, and tanks would respond with devastating return fire. In North Africa, Flak crews under commanders like Erwin Rommel used 88s to decimate British armor, sometimes halting entire offensives. But every engagement was a gamble. The open gun carriages left crews exposed, and a single tank shell could annihilate an entire crew in one blast. Even in defensive positions on the Eastern Front, Flak crews found themselves fighting Soviet armor in desperate last stands. They would switch from anti-aircraft shells to armor-piercing rounds in seconds, knowing that if the tanks broke through, there would be no retreat. The psychological strain was immense. One day they could be firing at high-altitude bombers. The next, they could be battling advancing T-34s at point-blank range. This dual role turned the Flak gun into one of the most feared weapons of the war, but it also increased the crew's exposure to danger dramatically. We'll touch later on how this versatility, while tactically brilliant, ultimately contributed to the staggering 80% casualty rate among these men. By 1943, the war in the air and on the ground had merged into a grinding war of attrition for Flak crews. The U.S. daylight bombing raids became larger and more frequent, with formations of hundreds of B-17 and B-24s, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. Each raid meant hours of intense combat for the crews, loading and firing without pause. They could bring down a dozen bombers in a single engagement, but the bombers that survived would still release their deadly cargo, often directly on top of the gun positions. Casualty rates climbed even higher when fuel and ammunition shortages began to bite. Crews were sometimes left with reduced supplies, forcing them to ration their fire even as enemy aircraft closed in. Replacement crews, often teenage conscripts or older reservists, had little time for training before being thrust into full-scale combat. Mistakes could be fatal. Setting a fuse wrong, loading the wrong shell type, or misreading targeting data could waste precious seconds, giving bombers the opening they needed. The stress was relentless. Even during lulls, the crews lived in constant readiness, sleeping in their uniforms, eating beside their guns, and enduring the endless wail of air raid sirens. Many suffered from hearing loss, concussions, or chronic injuries from the gun's recoil. And yet, despite the danger, morale was a strange mix of fatalism and grim pride. They knew the odds. Only 20% of them would survive the war, but many saw themselves as the shield of their homeland, standing between the bombers and the civilians below. In the next sections, we'll get into the war's final months, when desperation turned some of these crews into infantry, and the fate that awaited them when the guns finally fell silent. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the fate of the war was clear. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets were advancing from the east, and the Luftwaffe's air superiority was long gone. For Flak gun crews, the job changed almost overnight. Instead of defending industrial cities from the air, many found themselves firing at advancing ground forces. Entire batteries were dismantled from their fixed emplacements and hauled to makeshift defensive lines, where the 80s would be dug in as last-ditch anti-tank weapons. The crews knew this was a death sentence. Without air cover and surrounded by overwhelming enemy numbers, every engagement was a delaying action, meant only to buy time for retreats or evacuations. Flak towers, once considered impenetrable, became isolated fortresses cut off from resupply. In Berlin, during the final assault, some towers held out to the very end, firing at both Soviet tanks and aircraft until their ammunition ran dry. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Civilians packed into shelter levels below, wounded crewmen being treated in improvised infirmaries, and commanders debating when or if they should surrender. Soviet forces, knowing the towers were filled with both soldiers and civilians, often negotiated directly with their commanders to prevent unnecessary slaughter. But for crews stationed outside these concrete giants, giants, there was rarely such mercy. In many cases, flak crews captured on the battlefield were treated with hostility. Their role in downing countless Allied planes made them prime targets for revenge. Some were marched to POW camps, but others, especially those captured during chaotic urban fighting, were executed on the spot. For those who survived capture, the war's end didn't mean safety. Many were sent to labor camps for years after the fighting stopped. In the next section, we'll see how the small percentage of surviving flak crewmen faced a post-war world that often saw them not as soldiers, but as dangerous reminders of a regime everyone wanted to forget. When the war ended in May 1945, only about 20% of those who had served as flak gunners were still alive. Survival, however, came with its own set of challenges. Many returned home to find their cities in ruins, their families gone, and their military service branded as part of a defeated and vilified force. For the Allies, anti-aircraft gunners were seen not just as ordinary soldiers, but as the men directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of bomber crews. This stigma followed them into captivity and beyond. In POW camps, FLAK veterans were often singled out for harsh treatment. Some were forced to dismantle captured German weaponry or clear unexploded ordnance, an incredibly dangerous task that led to more casualties even after the war. In Soviet captivity, conditions were brutal, with many dying from disease, starvation, or exhaustion in labor camps deep in the USSR. Those who eventually returned home sometimes did so years later, stepping back into a world that had moved on without them. For younger veterans, reintegration into civilian life was especially hard. Many had spent their teenage years manning the guns, their formative experiences defined by constant danger, noise, and loss. Civilians couldn't relate to their stories, and many didn't want to hear them. Some veterans turned to manual labor, their skills with machinery finding use in factories or construction. Others, haunted by the memories of raids, screaming shells, and friends lost in an instant, withdrew into silence. Alcoholism, depression, and suicide rates among them were high, though rarely documented. And yet, despite this, some surviving crewmen looked back on their service with a grim sort of pride, not for the ideology they fought under, but for the skill, discipline, and camaraderie that kept them alive under impossible conditions. Later in this video, we'll discuss how historians view their role today and why the story of the flak gun crews has remained one of the most psychologically haunting chapters of World War II. The story of the flak gun crews is one of both technological achievement and human tragedy. The 88mm gun, in particular, became a symbol of German engineering, revered by military historians and feared by those who faced it. But for the men who operated them, this perfection came at an unbearable cost. Its versatility, as both an anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapon, made it indispensable to the German war effort, but it also meant the crews were thrown into the most dangerous situations imaginable. This combination of constant exposure, enemy targeting, and dual-role deployment is why their survival rate was so appallingly low. Psychologically, their story embodies the horror of industrial warfare. These were men locked into a cycle where skill and success only increased their chances of being killed, because a crew that consistently brought down bombers would inevitably become a top priority target. In this way, their fate mirrored that of bomber crews themselves. Both sides knew the odds, and both sides endured staggering losses. Today, flak guns sit in museums and memorial sites across Europe, silent and harmless. Visitors often marvel at their size, their engineering, and the stories of the battles they fought, but rarely is the full cost discussed. The deafening noise that left crews partially deaf, the shrapnel wounds that never fully healed, the friends buried in shallow graves beside the gun pits. The dark truth is that the flak crew's perfection as a fighting unit was precisely what doomed them. In remembering them, we're forced to confront a truth that applies to every weapon of war. The more effective it is, the higher the price paid by the ones who use it. And perhaps that's why, even decades later, the tale of the flak gun crews still sends a chill down the spine, not because of the weapon itself, but because of the men who stood behind it, knowing full well that their odds of coming home were barely 1 in 5.